Hi, and welcome to Voices of Unrest, an original play created and presented by Village Home Salem Thespians. With this show, we aim to spark conversation about race and racism in the United States by listening to and comparing diverse ideas. Following the unrest of last summer, we gathered a group of people with contrasting opinions and put together this series of interviews to help ourselves and our audience gain perspective of the world around us. Excerpts from these interviews, which took place between August and November of 2020, were compiled into this play. We are not here to tell you what to take away from this. We only hope that you use these words as food for thought to start conversations with your family and friends and colleagues. Our quote is, "Words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes a human voice to infuse them with shades of deeper meaning." Maya Angelou from I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings.
For a long time, there's been a term that gets used quite often when discussing Black Lives Matter, the term of a social contract. And Black people were forced into this social contract from the moment Africans were brought over to the United States on slave ships, where we were told, our ancestors were told, this is now your station in life. And this contract is drawn up by people without our consent, without our input, and without any regard for our lives.
This is Kent. He is a local school music teacher and uses he, him pronouns.
And over the last 400 years, that contract has just been removed, rewritten, and updated when the old way wasn't necessarily working out. So when slavery stopped, it became Black codes and slave codes and Jim Crow. And when Jim Crow didn't work out, it became, legalized segregation. It became white supremacy-based violence. And when that didn't necessarily work out, it became the war on drugs and the war on crime. And when that didn't work out, it became the criminalization of Black boys and girls in school. And the phrase Black Lives Matter means that those systems have been put in place to make Black lives not matter.
I mean, if you think about it, we can even go back to, Lincoln freeing the slaves. Everybody thinks, what a cool president. He had his eye on the ball. That was for financial gain. That was not because he gave a shit about Black people. That was because it financially benefited white people. And even still, if we look at what's happening, even in 2020, we can look at what that document said, which is you're free unless you're a criminal, right? Caveat. And now our jails are filled with Black and brown folks that are still doing free labor for white men, for rich white men.
This is Julianne, a Black activist and founder of Black Joy.
When we think about the labor movement and we talk about workers' rights, capitalism and racism go hand in hand. It always has. And unfortunately, I believe it always will. I don't know what you can do to curb one without curbing the other necessarily. But it absolutely goes hand in hand.
When did you become aware of Black Lives Matter?
Before June, I didn't know anything about the Black Lives Matter movement at all, other than the fact that in our family, we look at people of every color as exactly the same. We were all created by God, and we are all loved by Him.
Estelle, a mother and a Christian.
We treat everybody the same. We love them all, and nobody is better or worse than the other.
Next, we'll hear from a retired police executive who wishes to remain anonymous.
While race wasn't the topic that was at the forefront of many discussions I had, my exposure to other cultures, education, and interest in history illustrated the strength there is in appreciating the differences people have, whether it is race, culture, nationality, and more.
As the phrase Black Lives Matter has become more widely publicized and acknowledged, there have been disagreements over the meanings of the phrase and the organization. These are some responses we received to the question, what does Black Lives Matter mean?
I think the phrase itself carries the meaning of there's been a history of Black lives, and really any non-white lives. There's been a history of those lives not mattering in the sense of quality of life, opportunities, importance. And so now Black people are saying, actually, we do matter, and here's why. And I believe that the official organization of Black Lives Matter set out with that purpose in mind, to say, here's what's going on, here's what needs to be fixed, and here's what we're asking for.
It's very easy right now to just only be thinking about police brutality. And that's a big portion of it. But when we break down all of our systems, I want my life to matter in each different area. I want my life to matter in the judicial system. I want it to matter with my medical health. I want it to matter. And we've seen, like, just throughout time, there's so many disparities that Black people are dealing with. And I just want my life to matter in all of those areas. So to me, the words Black Lives Matter is so much broader than just police brutality, and so much broader than, just getting the police to behave or to abolish the police. I think we have to start looking at all of the systems that oppress Black people in order for our lives to matter. And so, that's what it means to me, is making sure that I can go anywhere a white person can go and receive the same treatment.
I believe that Black Lives Matter, it's showing that, yes, all lives may matter, but it's Black people that need to focus on them now, that we need to help. They're the ones that are being targeted for their race.
This is Carly, a white student from England.
There may be white people that are getting shot, but it's not because they're white. Black people are getting shot because they're Black.
So yeah, we have talked about the Black Lives Matter movement, and that sometimes people of different colors and creeds and different ways of living are treated terribly, and that's not right. That's not how God would want us to treat other people.
Next, we hear from Reverend Andy McCartney, the Associate Rector to St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Salem, Oregon.
Here at St. Paul's, we have a Black Lives Matter banner out front of our church. Actually, on both sides of the church, because we have fairly busy streets on either side of our building. We've gotten quite a bit of correspondence from the community people about that. And one of the things I hear very frequently in emails or letters or what have you, that Black Lives Matter is itself a racist organization, because people think that what it's trying to do is somehow elevate or privilege Black folks to the exclusion of others. And I really don't believe that is what they are trying to do.
I feel that when you say Black Lives Matter, that can be construed as you're excluding other people's lives.
It is an inclusive saying, yeah.
Alex Bailey, a high school student in Minneapolis.
Well, Black Lives Matter. I'm going to kind of contradict myself here for a second, but it'll make sense. Black Lives Matter is specifically talking about Black lives, but that's not saying that all minoritized groups should not be treated equally. Like right now, Black Lives Matter is the most prevalent movement. It's the one that needs most of our attention right now.
Next, we hear from Caitlin, a student in France whose parents are Chinese.
All lives don't matter until Black lives matter. But I think that racism is towards every ethnicity. And if we don't fight for Black people, that means we don't think that their lives matter, or if their lives matter, ours don't. So as an Asian person, I'm in a position that I feel concerned about racism, even if it's for Black people, for Asian people, or everyone. So yes, everyone should be fighting for this movement.
This is James, an 18-year-old from our local community.
Any competent person should not have a problem with that phrase. It's an obvious matter of fact. The organization, I have some qualms with Black Lives Matter, the organization. To my knowledge, what I've seen, they're an organization that is expressively on the left of the spectrum, certainly further left than some would care.
I separate Black Lives Matter as an organization from the idea. The organization leaders have political underpinnings that I do not support, such as a Marxist globalist philosophy and a de-emphasis of the nuclear family. The organization leaders have a political agenda, and they use their influence to pursue this in a number of legislative arenas. However, the idea of Black Lives Matter that many strongly identify with is to fight against police brutality against persons of color and other marginalized communities. To me, the idea of Black Lives Matter is that they want to ensure the Black community is heard and is never again treated as if their lives don't matter. It is not just about their physical lives. It means their hopes and dreams have an opportunity to flourish without being disregarded or discriminated against.
I will gladly go along with someone in support for the phrase, for the undeniable fact that human life, that we are all intrinsically valuable and precious because we have been created by a great creator, by God. And that does not, whether we have different levels of melanin or perhaps, we have one arm or something, that does not take away an important part of our value, of our intrinsic value as created beings.
Whether you're African American, whether you're white, whether you're Asian, every life matters. So when I hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, I go, every life is sacred. To have somebody be killed by violence is horrible. Anybody, child, old person, young person, whatever color, and have nothing be done about it is a terrible thing. And I think that every life that is lost horribly, there should be justice for that. I think the phrase Black Lives Matter has been twisted in a lot of violence has happened in that phrase behind it. The group Black Lives Matter as a whole, at least through the media, has caused a lot of problems. But when I hear the phrase Black Lives Matter, every life matters. I don't look at it as a group, I look at it as a movement for change.
Yes, Black Lives Matter is a political issue, but I believe it is also a moral and ethical and therefore theological issue. This involves poverty and suffering and discrimination. How can the church not have something to say about that? And how can we wash our hands of the struggles that our fellow citizens of this country are having just by saying, well, it's political, we don't go there? Yeah, it's political, but it's other things too.
Our next interviewee is Cindy.
What's happening is the awakening of the people from a very deep and dangerous sleep. Even me, as a Black person, I've been asleep in so many ways. But also, it must be the awakening of all the targeted, marginalized, divided folks to wake up. I think that structural racism harms every human being, but those at the bottom have a lot more wounds to show for it. And so those at the bottom need to really get the look at their wounding and come to the center and make sure they're at the center of the decision-making table.
In this section, we aim to spotlight the story of one of our participants who shared her tragic story of navigating society as a Black woman in the 90s.
So my children are adults. The oldest one, who clearly has had structural racism, has had a very explicit and implicit impact on him. I guess the important piece would be, how did I talk to them with them as they were children? And their father, who died in 97 he died from pancreatic cancer, but I wrote even before that he had been diagnosed. He was diagnosed June 25th on his birthday, but I wrote in my diary in May that he was going to call death to him. I knew he wouldn't commit suicide because we had seen the impact of a dear African-American brother who would put his whole heart and soul into becoming a self-made millionaire, which meant working away from his family at the Alaskan oil fields and whatever. And finally, well, the way things ended up, a little wealth eluded him. He took his own life and left his wife and 2 children. We were best friends back then. So that had a really big impact on my husband and me. And so when I wrote that in my diary, I knew clearly that my husband would not take his own life. Because what goes wrong on your body has to do with your emotions, whether you're self-loathing or overworking, or you'll develop our fear. It's just that it's all connected. So I, being in a marriage that was falling apart, and when we were in the process of trying to get a divorce, but still co-parenting in the same house, I witnessed his anger, his rage, the betrayal of his job, and I saw it accumulating. And one day, I still to this day, I remember him. And it's like, I'll say, one of the last betrayals was he had worked in the pharmacy as a pharmacist at Fred Meyer's and Safeway, and he had been transferred around. And his last job was, the new boss was a white woman who was, she saw him as, I guess, I want to say, an N-word. I mean, she treated him very rudely, and he was not a super organized person, but very honest. His customers loved him. And when the audit would come around every year, the regular audits to see, if you have things in order and stuff, it was always a very, very stressful time for him. And he would be up for hours getting the records, right. Not that he did anything illegal or trying to doctor the records. It was just getting the paperwork and everything in order. So it was very stressful. And he had gone through that. And then he finds out a week later that he's going to have a narcotic audit. And he just randomly happened to be the only pharmacist in Vancouver that randomly was chosen to be audited. His being seen by his job as valuable and important was important to his self-esteem. He hadn't done, I think, the work that you need to do to sort out all of the messages that you give yourself that you're not valuable, that you're not worthy. So he had built this worthlessness around him. This company who he thought he was so valuable. The first day went from like hourly and overtime wage into salary wage. And that was a big blow for him and the other pharmacists. And then, and then to have this audit of him alone. And so because he had made friends with some of the folks at the top, he finally called them, and he passed it on. But it took a lot of work, a lot of sweat, a lot of tears to get those records in order. And he says, hey, what is this about? Really, why? Why was I chosen? And the guy was honest with him. He said, well, Black pharmacists in California that were selling drugs out the back door. And that was like everything was falling apart. So the day that I wrote in my diary, I don't remember exactly what I said to him. It wasn't a big argument. And he said simply, don't you realize I don't have any joy in my life? And he said it with such agony and such pain and from such a depth. And then he did stop. And he said, maybe the girls. And his second son was his namesake. So I knew that was awfully important. The oldest son had fallen through the cracks, and so he couldn't claim him to create the self-esteem he needed. So he said, maybe the girls. He said, maybe this much with the girls. And I know he was going to call, in my belief, in my spiritual belief, you can call death to you. I said in my mind, it might be that he's going to go through a green light, like he wouldn't purposefully go through a red light, but he might go through a green light and someone else would be running a red light and hit his car and kill him. There were other scenarios. So I thought of possibilities of ways that he would call it death. He was ready to leave. It's been too much. And that was in May. In June was the graduation of his second son, his namesake. I said his work was so much a part of his sense of self, but the marriage was failing, breaking away too. So the success of his 3 younger children was critically important to him. And Robbie was a basketball player. He was on the team and he always got to open up because they liked him. And he was so personable. That's my second son. And he was also intelligent. And so my husband, he has said he's going to make it so Robbie can go to any school that he chooses, And if he had to take out a loan or whatever, Robbie was was going to be, Robbie was going to be that person that would take the next step up from where his dad was, and make the wealth. And, that was his dream. And so that day, we have a picture with Robbie with his dad as graduation uniform. And that was in mid-June. The day after, his dad woke up and said he couldn't go to work. He's going to go to a doctor. And when he came back, he said he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and that he had 3 to 6 months to live. And as it turned out, what we found out, he had been, in his dedication to his job, to be seen as somebody that whole year when his pain had come up, he would work through the whole day, 10 hours a day sometimes, and then go to the emergency room at night. And because we were in the process of divorcing, I had no idea. We lived separate lives in that sense. And he didn't tell any of us or his colleagues that he worked with, that he was very close to. So that was the first day he did not go to work in over a year. And that was the last. He never went back to work. He was never able to go back to work. And 3 months later, on September 20th, he died from what they say, pancreatic cancer. But that was just a symptom of a much, much deeper pain and sense of loss of self and hope. And so he died.
As we are having a conversation about race, we have highlighted some other experiences that were shared with us from people of color in our community.
My mom is actually quite racist. Oddly enough, so I don't really speak to her about anything. But my dad and I marched on DC together. So, my whole family is there for it.
Next, we hear from Angelique. They are a Latinx activist and a member of Latinos Unidos Siempre.
Even though I'm a person of color, I still feel like a lot of people in my community, especially like lighter skinned people, they are still very anti-Black. And the Latinx community in general, people are anti-Black.
Next is Summer, a 45-year-old woman involved in the local community.
I grew up right in Eugene and then moved to Portland. And within the last 5 years, I really realized that I was subjected to a lot of racism. And really, I just really thought it was part of life. I didn't really know any different. The kids of color were just treated differently by the police. And that's all that I ever knew.
I think that there really is like a lack of accountability within Latinx communities. A lot of Latinx communities will always, they'll make excuses for their anti-Blackness. They'll make excuses for supporting the police.
Here are Jessica's thoughts. She's a Black community member with a background working in local sheriff's office.
I grew up in Salem, which is majority white, and my dad was a Black business owner. I was surrounded by well-off white people, being one of the only minority businesses for 2 decades. And I think that the shocking part in the friend groups, when I talked to them about my experience, is I had to I guess it's 2 parts. I had to realize for me that I had actually been very conditioned, whitewashed, conditioned, living here my whole life, that I didn't recognize it until I moved, until I went to Louisiana to see some of my family on my dad's side, and realized that I had been conditioned and gaslighted constantly by thinking I'm not okay, right? I'm not okay in my skin. Maybe I'm really loud, maybe all of these things, right? And I finally was in an area in a city where it was not just me and we were the majority. And I never felt anything about it. It was almost as if, it was such a culture shock for me to just be in a room. And I was at the Hilton Hotel and everyone who was working there, they were all Black. And I was like, wait, what? You all work here? That's not a thing. And that was just my first experience. And so for me, it forced me to uncover, wow, I have been letting people in my life tell me about myself. And I haven't really figured out my own identity and who I am, what I stand for. And when I was around my family, recognizing we're all the same, like we actually do the same mannerisms. We talk with our hands, we speak loud, we're outgoing, and it's not, I'm afraid of you, and it's not, you're too aggressive, and all of those things. So I think that was where it started for me. And that was back in, that was 2016 when I went there. So that was a big culture shock for me. And then when it comes to people that I've had conversations with, that's the story I tell them, because I need them to recognize that, like, I've lived here my whole life and thought there was something wrong with me. And I have allowed white people to speak to me in a demeaning way, and explaining to people there's a difference. There's a difference between overt racism, right? And there's different types of racism. And Oregon is the king and queen of microaggressions. And people don't even know what a microaggression is until you bring it up. And they're like, oh, I never realized that could be a problem. And so for me, it's been a big conversation of, yes, we're not the South, where you know that when you cross this line, you shouldn't be there because you're Black or brown, right? But it's not until you're in the conversations with people and you recognize that they have a harbor of bias that you didn't know until you have started a conversation. My good friend who used to live here but moved back to Philly uses an analogy of, like, we all live in the same house. You can sleep in the rooms you want, you can go wherever you want. However, in this house, there are landmines, and the landmines don't pop out to the majority. They don't pop out to the white people. But as a Black person, every step you take, you are either stepping on safe land or landmine, and you won't know until you step on it. And that was like the analogy he gave to my coworker about the microaggressions, the conversation. Like, yeah, we're not overtly racist here in Oregon, but until you spend time with somebody and have a conversation, and you recognize that something they say triggers actually a very deep-rooted racist and biased thought, they're like, oh, you actually are kind of a douche. And you don't know it, right? They're not aware of it.
Yeah, so when I was younger, I actually really hated being a person of color. I wanted to be white. I hated it so much because I was just like around a lot of white people, and I thought it was like the best thing to be. And I found that a lot of people, other people of color, when I was like very young, also believed this same thing. And as I got older, I started believing the fallacy that like all of us are equal, all of us had equal opportunities. But then as I got older into like 8th grade and high school, I realized there were a lot of things that I didn't have the same opportunities for just because of like my economic status. Because of my parents' documentation, I kind of went through this whole like roller coaster with different stages where I kind of hated being a POC, and then I liked being a POC, and I thought that I was equal. But then I realized that I wasn't really equal.
You know, what I was talking about with my son, where it's just like, most kids, you can get into a school fight and you're not, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But if your skin is brown and you're seen as a threat, something as simple as a school fight can turn into you not coming home. And there's nothing your parents can do about it. Once the state says that you're a ward of the state, that's it. Your parents can't take you home if they want to. So I think that's really, it's about he has to hold himself to a higher standard. He doesn't get to make the same mistakes as his counterparts because it could end very differently for him.
May 25th, 2020, a 46-year-old Black man named George Floyd died at the hands of police in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The incident became very public as videos from witnesses surfaced of a police officer kneeling on a man's neck for over 9 minutes and killing him. This sparked a lot of emotions in the hearts of people internationally, so we asked people to share how it had made them feel.
George Floyd died on my birthday. It impacted me in a real weird way, And I think collectively, like I said, I don't know if you guys have heard of Black body trauma, but it's a real thing. And so every time a Black person, I view this, I'm traumatized, right? Like a part of me is like, oh, and George Floyd was a breaking point. I think for a lot of people. I think that it was breaking point for America collectively. If you're an ally, you were also like, whoa, what? And I think a lot of people woke up and were like, so this has been happening. Yes. So, and the names keep adding. I think Breonna Taylor and that decision specifically impacted me pretty greatly. I took that kind of difficult because Black women, people often show up in droves to protest for Black men, but Black women not so much. Black trans folk even less. And the bottom line is to be a Black person in America right now, you are a target. And since Trump got in office, that's even more so. I personally have been physically assaulted by white supremacists in Oregon on the Capitol steps. So I know that the danger is very real. And I think the more the more and more we see this, the more and more we recognize that we're not safe.
Like, hearing names of people, it always seems so far away.
This is Sydney, another student from Minnesota.
And now that it happened right in the city, right below me, it felt so much more real, like I said before. And it's really weird to think that, there's a whole group of people that want justice for millions of people affected by police brutality, systemic racism, casual racism, and that doesn't happen. It's really hard to think about.
I think when we take time to investigate and to look into things, from my view, from my worldview, and from what I've seen with a lot of these incidents, you see that when push comes to shove and the evidence comes out, you see that many of these instances were justified.
Next is Miller, a white man in his late 20s.
Well, I mean, basically, if you're not doing anything, or say you get pulled over for speeding or something, they pull you out of the car and putting you on the hood or something. Just, yeah, that's police. I mean, I wouldn't call it brutality, but it's using unnecessary force. And I think a lot of the stuff with George Floyd, that was way over the top. I mean, that dude he's a straight up murderer. He murdered that guy. And if you're in handcuffs already, you got 4 officers, put the guy in the back, put him in the back of the car. Don't sit on his neck. I mean, that's just being a murderer, basically.
What we see right now is we see people who jump to conclusions. And that's always a thing that happens when you have a narrative to sell.
Next is Desi, another international student. She lives in Italy.
I mean, I think there's ways and ways to try to stop a person. And I remember watching the video and I couldn't watch it. I tried to, but it just kept going forward because I just couldn't watch it. And it really affected me. Even just thinking about it makes me kind of tear up because it was a really, really bad video. And as I said, I think there's ways and ways to stop someone, even if they did something wrong. Because there's something called justice.
It's these guys just, beat the shit out of this guy. And then they all just get off scot-free. It's ridiculous. And there's the other option to do is really to weed out the bad ones. It's to make an example of them, that you can't do that. You should go to jail. So I don't think the other 3 standing there should necessarily go to jail, but I think there has to be some kind of punishment for actually, throw them in fucking jail too. I mean, your job is to serve and protect, and you basically went against your oath by not protecting that man and not, giving him his day in court. So yeah, throw him in jail.
And someone killing just because they're afraid or they can't manage their power, it really affects me.
That was such a blow for Minnesota. Minnesota is typically considered as the passive aggressive state or the nice state. And so when something like the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and other names, when that happened, everybody, no matter if you were 6 months old or on your deathbed, we all felt a shift. We all said, okay, we're no longer the nice state. We are now the state that is becoming the epicenter of the Black Lives Matter movement, and not for a good reason. We are not the state that held a protest that changed laws, changed minds.
I've seen a lot of examples of people coming and protesting. In a lot of these cases, we've seen rioting and destruction before the full story could come out. But people did not wait for the full story. They heard that someone died and that consistently a certain type of person was killed by another certain type of person or by a certain group of people. And before waiting to find out, well, was it murder or was it something that was justified? Were these deaths or incidents, especially the deaths, were these some of these incidents without justification, or are there more behind them? And when we see that upon further investigation in a lot of these scenarios and a lot of these incidents, we see that there was more to the story. By the time that the truth comes out, it's too late. People have preconceptions in their head, and they really can't back down from that.
We're the state that houses people who are willing to kill other people just because they're scared. And so we all felt that shit. We all said, okay, we're never ever going to be considered the nice state again. So how can we start changing that? How can we start re-educating? How can we start moving funds to house workshops and training seminars? How can we create change so that we can start thinking about becoming a nice state again?
Especially the names after George Floyd. Like, that's what gets me. Because now the whole world is watching and you still think you can kill Black people.
The existence of systemic racism, the concept that race is ingrained in our society, can be a divisive issue. We asked people what they thought about systemic racism and whether it exists.
There is nothing to constitute that the United States of America as a whole believes that Black people or any group of people are inferior because of their skin tone or religious belief.
If you think racism is principally or only a sort of emotion level hostility towards people of color, then of course, a lot of people are like, I would never use the N-word. I would, never say America is for whites only. I would never say I wouldn't hire someone because they're a person of color. And I think that's largely true.
If you believe that to its core, and I'm taking the literal definition of the words, if you believe that among all groups, the whole entire system of America, the body, the market, society, believes as a whole that one group of people or another are inherently less valuable or inferior because of the qualities that make them different, skin color, skin tone, or religious beliefs, to believe that America is like that at our current place in the world, in our current time and setting, is wrong. It's not at all correct.
What they're not understanding is that there's so much overwhelming sociological data to show disparities and all kinds of outcomes between white folk and people of color in this country. And so it isn't, we hate Black people. It's that this country got set up in such a way as to privilege one section of society to the disadvantage of another section. And we need to take a look at it. That's what I think this is really about.
Affirmative action came and went based on the idea that it was reversed from active action. And even a lot of some Black people, especially the higher echelon ones, would say, we don't need that anymore, The playing field is equal now. Everything needs to be colorblind. And for the first time today, I'm getting a much deeper understanding of the danger of colorblind in a society that has structural racism built in. You cannot pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. The amount of energy it will take, it's like swimming across a lake that has huge stormy waves. And let's say you are being compared to the white person swimming across the lake. Well, comparatively, they've got a smooth, calm lake to swim across to get to the other side. And in actuality, the other side, in a way, it's even closer. They're not even equal length that we're compared to, swimming further, harder against bigger waves. So energetically, we're just not going to get to the other side in the same way as the others. And yeah, we're being pointed at as not being good swimmers. We're just poor swimmers, that's all.
I mean, if you dig in, you have to dig into the history to recognize that there are some wheels that have been constantly turning over the past, centuries.
Next up is Reverend Rick, a white member of the community and the Reverend of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Salem.
When I was growing up, every time the garbage truck would come around, it was always a bunch of black convicts they were basically pressed into service and forced. They were probably arrested for loitering or something, who knows what, but they were swept up by the law and they were basically turned into slaves again, just by the way the system worked.
Financing and housing discrimination lawsuits are still being brought up in this decade. Of course, our current president,
At the time of this interview, that was Donald Trump,
was sued for not renting to African American tenants in the 60s and 70s, where his father was, and then he was sued in the 90s. Like you mentioned before, with the concept of redlining, where bankers would say, okay, this is the area of town that you shouldn't rent to wealthy white people or to wealthy anybody. This is the place that you shouldn't rent, therefore preventing any type of money from entering into that community to make it better, which is why you still have a lot of sections of these large cities that are so poverty stricken because they've been denied the influx of resources for so long. In education, a Supreme Court case had to decide the validity and ability for Black children to go to school with white children. And there were schools in the South who still chose to not carry out that law until they had to, until federal officers came and enforced it. So, and this is in the 50s and 60s. Ruby Bridges is only 60 years old, and she was one of the first little Black girls to go to an all-white elementary school, and she's still alive. My grandparents went through segregation. My parents only went into work and started school 10 years after segregation became illegal. So for people to say it's not systemic, my own response has always been, if you've never had a court case decide if you can get health care or go to school, you have very little footing to say whether something is systemic or not, and whether something prevails or not. There's very little footing for you. So yes, systemic racism is very much alive and well. People have to understand that it's not just straight up, I'm not renting to you because you're Black, but it's, I'm going to charge you 3 times your rent or whatever, or 4 times your rent. Or I'm going to say that the income requirement for you to rent is that you have to be making 4 times the rent. So Black people apply, most Black people apply for something like low income housing because they can only work low income, minimum wage, below minimum wage jobs because of where they live. And they don't have effective transportation. So they have to take a bus route. And then they have to live where a bus picks them up. And buses tend to pick people up, usually in low income housing budgets, because that's where most people live. Because again, most people are working low income jobs. So it's a vicious cycle.
You're at the school board level where they have this whole equity lens. But somehow this equity lens does not include listening to the words that are coming out of brown children's mouths. So that's wild, right? So there's just zero accountability. And when you ask, you're like, okay, I'm not happy with how this turned out. I think race did play a part. Well, then you write to some other white person or you file a complaint with some other white person who tells you no. So it's wild. And it's like that throughout systems. It's like that from the ground up.
I didn't get denied housing because I'm Black. I got denied housing because of the job I work, because of the transportation I lack, because of the hiring processes that someone else went through, the hiring process that somebody else enacts because of their own biases, which led me to the point where I didn't get the job because I work a minimum wage job, because someone hired me based on biases, or someone didn't hire me based on biases.
And of course, police brutality is a big, big part of that, right? The disparity in outcomes between how people of color are treated by law enforcement is really remarkable and needs attention. It is an imperative moral issue.
We've seen a lot of, how do I say it? People who manufacture hate crimes. There's been a number of situations where you have had people who have been brought to local and even some national attention because they manufacture a hate crime.
As far as the existence of systemic racism, I don't share that opinion.
Well, it's obvious. There's no accountability. If we're talking about just here, there's no accountability within local government, zero. Anytime you ask, you know what's going on or why the police didn't react the same way to white supremacists as they do to black people, it's always someone else's problem. It's, well, we don't handle that. That's this person. And we don't do that. That's this person. But we do equity and inclusion. And equity and inclusion is just, I am so tired of those words because it's not cultural competence and it is not anti-racism. And so you hear this and it goes, it's throughout, the system.
The problem of overarching statements such as systemic racism is that it indicates that everything, and perhaps everyone, is racist and intentionally an obstacle to one racial group or in order to assist another group to get ahead. The problem I see is by believing everything is racist in the system, then nothing is. I'm a practical problem solver. I have never found anything to be wholly wrong or wholly right either. It is unfortunately an issue I see in academia, especially, to use broad strokes to describe a system.
Another reason I don't believe that systemic racism is a problem in the United States of America is because we've seen, I'm sure you could count numerous examples of companies and corporations, organizations that have come out in support of Black Lives Matter. Not just the phrase, but the organization itself. Everyone with the black squares, a poster, a profile picture, and how widespread it is. It's not something that's in contention. I'd like to say it's not a controversy to believe in justice, to believe that America has issues, has problems, but it's a controversy, it is a non-controversy or non-issue. I think because we've seen how many people in organizations and groups have come out in support of this. And there's nothing that would indicate that there is resistance of people saying this. The culture is in support of this, is in favor. So no, I don't believe that America is systemically racist. Not at all. Not in our current point in time. Because you look at multicultural nations in the world, I don't think you see any other nation that has a diverse set of people in authority. You don't see the diversity that you see. Diversity in thought and in people in power. People say that because we have President Barack Obama as our president for 8 years, it doesn't mean, because he was president, it doesn't mean that there isn't racism. But it also doesn't mean that we're racist. Because you look at multicultural countries in the world, America is up there. It very well could be leading. As you see with leaders, Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, our senators and representatives who come from all different backgrounds. There's nothing else like that in the world. America is truly special and exceptional in that regard, where you have such a different and diverse landscape of not just ethnic and cultural diversity, but diversity of thought. That's always what's made America special.
If the machine is working in a particular way, which it obviously is, maybe the thing to do is to change the machine.
Not only is this a conversation about race, but about police and their relationship to the community. So we asked what people's current feelings towards the police were.
I have a positive bias towards the police and their role in their communities, in the relationship to the community. So we asked, and their role in their communities due to my experience and professional relationship. It is in the best interest of both the community and police department to guard against and continuously address this issue. Policing is a local issue and should be addressed at that level. Often you will hear people share an opinion that policing is in need of great reform based on the activities they see in the media. Their overall impression is that the profession, which each year has in the neighborhood of 45 to 60 million interactions with people in this country, is in need of great change from a small selection of encounters drawn from around the country. But studies show that if you ask them about their own police agencies, often most, but certainly not all, will be satisfied with their service. This summer, after significant protests of police brutality, a poll of Black Americans found that over 80% wanted the same or more policing in their community, not less.
I've never necessarily liked the police, but I've met a lot of police or cops that are good people. My girlfriend's dad's a cop. Is one of the greatest guys I've ever known. I get a lot of cops that come into our shop and they're great guys. And it kind of comes back to if you treat me well, I got nothing to say against you, basically.
With that said, there are some police agencies and even regions of police agencies that it is clear are not using the best data, training, hiring, supervision, and tactics to serve their community. And some would be too many. They must be held accountable and changed.
And Jessica, are you still working for the sheriff's office?
I'm not. I currently am in ministry full time. I left there in January, and I'm blessed that I did. I left on good terms. I was actually very happy that I left when I did. And I didn't have to be around all the stuff because I was surrounded by people who believed that, like I said, movement and words, right? There's a difference. And depending on who you speak to, the movement ruffled a lot of law enforcement feathers. But it also had to do a lot with ignorance. And I was very aware of who those people were, and I didn't engage. But for me, I feel safe that I'm not working there because I didn't want to be, I was one of few people of color in the agency. I wasn't a deputy, but I did all of like the groundwork for the deputies. And so I think for me, I didn't want to be the person that my bosses asked all the questions. Hey, so how do you feel about this? You know, I don't want to be that black voice where I'm always getting asked everything. So for me, like, I wasn't here for that because I got sick of being the black person that everyone wanted to bombard with all of their white fragility questions and all that stuff.
I agree with yay cab rhetoric. I do think that all cops are bad. And I don't just mean that in the profession they're bad. I mean that if you willingly join a profession, you willingly train to become a cop when you know that there are all these flaws, when you know that cops are killing people, when you know the cops are policing people, when there are clear statistics prove that communities of color and low-income communities are disproportionately policed. When you choose to enter a profession like that, it obviously says a lot about your character. It says that you don't really care about communities of color. It says that you're privileged enough to show a blind eye. So I think that obviously the entire profession of being a police officer is bad, but if you choose to enter that profession, I also think you're equally as bad for doing that. I don't think that there are any good cops. It doesn't matter if, you know, your cop uncle is nice to you. I still think he's a bad person for deciding to be a cop. And the only way to stop being a bad person is to quit his job and stop being a police officer.
Fucking ridiculous. And I think the people that say that are bastards themselves, then pretty much. I mean, to just completely generalize one group of people, it's the same as racism. It's literally the same, which is kind of funny. It's kind of ironic that, you know, all these people, they're fighting against racism, but at the same time, they'll say this entire group of people are bastards and they should die.
I get why people ascribe to that phrase. I understand, and I will never tell anybody that they shouldn't believe that. Personally, because I have family in law enforcement, I approach this concept of police brutality with such a desire to dig deeper and work at it. Like, I so want to just work at deconstructing this thing from the inside out, because I have family members who were in law enforcement, they're now retired, who tried to improve things from the inside, they tried to do the work and got shut down at every quarter, every attempt. They were unsuccessful because there was such a toxic fraternal mindset in policing. It's a profession that's been bastardized from the beginning, because at the very beginning, again, it was paying poor white men to catch runaway slaves. And then it turned into paying men to catch runaway slaves and stop legging in prostitution. And then it turned into paying people to enforce the laws in the books that prevented non-white people from doing things. And so the system has been bastardized from the very beginning. So every police officer is part of a bastardized system. And the ones that are trying to change that from the inside are not supported enough. They're not supported enough. You try to speak up, you get fired. You get put on death duty. You get put in a position that inhibits your power and your presence in these situations. But again, I'm not going to tell anyone that they can't say that because they're inclined to believe that. Because again, I don't know what's happened in their life to where they ascribe to that thing. And not everyone wants to sit down and dig in and deconstruct this stuff and rebuild it. But I do want to get to that point where people can come together and figure that out. So I understand it, I comprehend it, and I will let people ascribe to that need to. But for me, the system is bastardized, not necessarily everyone involved in it. I think all cops are part of a bastardized system, right?
I've seen on Facebook, ACAB or all cops are bastards, but I don't believe I don't believe in that because there are so many that are anti-racist. They are not racist at all. They understand and they empathize. So there are issues, but it's not the policing system as a whole. It's just because there are certain police officers highlighted. It's always the worst things that I've seen rather than all of the little good things, if that makes sense.
Sayer, another student from Minneapolis, shares his conflicting thoughts on the issue.
My dad is a police officer. Of course, we have different opinions. He is probably the sweetest man I've probably ever met. But I struggle when he talks about, even if it doesn't have anything to do with Black Lives Matter, if he starts talking about like a call he went on last night, I started feeling uncomfortable because it reminds me like my dad is an oppressor, right? Is considered an oppressor. But I'm like, I'm considered because I'm white, I'm considered an oppressor. And I understand that. But I feel like he doesn't want to realize that. He wants to live in his own world where he is helping everyone. It's so hard to explain. Like there's such an inner battle between like I want to support the police because my dad's an officer, but I don't want to support the police because of what they're doing.
We held an interview with another person from England who wishes to remain anonymous. Here are their thoughts.
American police here have always been portrayed as racist gun carriers. That's just how they've been portrayed. And then in the UK, when I was little, we were kind of raised to trust the police. They're nice. If you get lost, go and see them. I imagine there's a few of them who are genuinely nice people who just want to help out, but I can definitely understand the institutional racism and why that makes them bastards, because it does if they're going to be racist, quite frankly. I mean, there was some data released in the media today by the Guardian newspaper that Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched.
We don't put the policemen into the same category of violent policemen, because we know that we are very proud of some policemen that make peace in France, like they protect us. And no, we don't. We're not afraid of policemen, and we don't see the policeman as a racist person. I think that this policeman that killed Black people, they definitely were racist, but like not every policeman, just the ones who act like they are racist. And yes, I think it is a very individual thing. Like it's not systematic.
I respect the police and I support them. I want them to be here. I don't believe that they're bad guys. As in the case of George Floyd, I think that there are bad apples in every bunch, but I don't think that we should let the actions of somebody who needed help destroy our feelings for all policemen. Because without the police, I think that our world would be a lot worse off.
They really openly don't give a hoot here. And there's a complete disregard and a lack for you even being a human when you call the police here. And that's in Kaiser, in Salem, that I've experienced. There are a couple, Kaiser is really small. And so, like, I know all the police officers, and it's just from my community, just from my community involvement. And there are some of that are better than others. It's always been a stereotypical type of interaction. I almost black out because I got so nervous and scared. I've only been pulled over one time, actually in Kaiser. And I had to tell the police officer that I was about to have a panic attack because I could see his weapon, and he was actually very kind and he felt safe enough. He put his weapon in his car. But yeah, so it hasn't been great. I mean, we were harassed by the police as kids, growing up in a college town, I guess. And Eugene had a strict curfew for minors and kids and stuff. And so we were really harassed. And even though I had a lot of contact then, it's never made it so that it's okay. Now, I didn't build up some weird tolerance to the police or anything like that.
After asking about people's general feelings towards the police, and with the rising popularity in phrases like ACAB and defund the police, we started asking if they felt the police needed any sort of reform.
I don't believe in reform at all because I think it's a completely broke system. And so, yeah, I don't think we should totally abolish it at all. I think we should totally abolish it at all. I'm not a fan of the police whatsoever, any part of that programming. It's a dangerous brotherhood, especially here. And yeah, I don't want any part of it. it raises an extreme anxiety to even see the police, and it always has. So yeah, I'm not a fan.
I think instead of completely defunding it, I think they should draw money away to re-educate it.
I think that the only way to counter those problems, because we've tried so many forms of reforms, we've tried to fix the system that exists and tried to keep it. But obviously it's not working because there isn't an amount of bias training that will stop this from happening. There isn't an amount of reform that will stop police officers from perpetuating this superiority behavior where they feel like they're more superior than people of color, specifically Black people. And so the only way to solve that problem is really to get rid of that system as a whole.
Use training led by people of color or people in the LGBTQ community, people with mental disabilities and stuff like that. Use that to re-educate and rebuild that foundation and build it so it can be as equal and as open as possible.
Most always you can make something better. There's always ways to improve. And I don't think that comes with the improvement does not come with cutting funds or defunding, but rather people call for full body cams. Well, let's give that to them. Let's ensure that police officers always have the greatest ability to give the most accurate details of the situation. The cameras that are fuzzy looked like they were manufactured in 1980. We need to move on from those. Perhaps we need more equipment. They need to have more resources. We need to allow the process to play out. We also need an understanding to understand that what they go through is different than most anyone else will go through. The choices and decisions that they have to make. But as far as specific reform, I'm unsure as it relates to the banning of chokeholds or things like that. I can see the case being made for it.
But I also think that comes with, I think that honestly, society and the media has pushed this narrative of it being, I'm just afraid for my life, so this is how I'm going to respond. And I think they've made that like a reoccurring narrative that it's easy to hide behind. I am definitely not saying that I don't like all the instances that we've seen and that it could have been handled differently. I can even tell you that people that I know in law enforcement, like it could have been handled differently. It didn't have to get to that point. But when we talk about brutality, the biggest topic that's underlying is de-escalation. And at what point in the conversation does de-escalation start when there is a conflict with the deputy, a cop, and somebody who's being arrested? De-escalation should start right at the beginning. And I think that because there hasn't been like a clear definition of this is how we would de-escalate the situation before it needs to get to a physical, force. And I think, so that I think that part of it, the reform piece, I think is just really, it should be diving into how we train, what our de-escalation tactics are. And then also, is this deputy or cop in the right state of mind to be doing the job? I mean, we've seen like some of the instances that we've seen over the past decade in these conversations is like, this cop has had lots of complaints. This cop has had lots of, and so they are people who are not really fit for the job because they just don't know how to deal with human decency, period. And so they make mistakes, right? And this just happened to be the mistake. I got caught, but they've made all these mistakes before. So I think that it really comes down to each agency and how they are talking about de-escalation, how they are finding somebody fit to do the job properly, and then also accountability. What's the accountability of you at the end of the day?
Yeah, so like I said before, I've been to a couple of the Portland protests, which have been way worse than the Salem ones. The Salem ones did get very bad at one point, but I think the overall police reaction just continues to show us that we don't really have a need for police. If police really thought they weren't that bad, they wouldn't react by macing people. They wouldn't react by throwing tear gas. They wouldn't react by throwing a bunch of people in jail or by causing other harm to just normal civilians who are trying to protest for racial justice. If they really believed that they were good people, I feel like they would try to come and make community solutions with these people who are obviously at a state of unrest because of all of the harm that they're seeing happen in the community. But when they continue to harm community members, again, it obviously just shows that there really is no need for them, and that they know they have superiority over these people. They know they have more power over them, which obviously is terrible to see. And then we see these systems of police that harm people at protests continue to be supported by other policing systems, like the military or the National Guard, which is even worse to see.
Because I worked in law enforcement specifically, I see the value in what the justice system could look like. And I don't believe in the movement's hands when the conversation is defunding the police and we're not using the right terminology versus defunding versus reallocating money and really understanding how the structures work on when money gets put in through taxpayers. Where does that money go? Who gets the bulk of it? And then how can we take that money and invest it into Black lives, invest it into better care, better mental health, better all that stuff. So when it comes to the movement, I feel like there's a disconnect in like, yes, we need to defund the police. And I'm like, well, we know that if that happens is actual chaos. But there are people who work in law enforcement agencies that are not as hell-bent on killing Black people all the time, or their bias doesn't show as much. But we also live in Oregon, and I have been, because I've served in the public eye, and I know our sheriff, I know our chief, I know pretty much everybody who's to know that makes the decisions in the city. We can't compare ourselves to the East Coast. And every time there is a movement that happens where we're comparing things that have happened somewhere else, we know that they have a lot more overt racism, bias, discrimination. It doesn't really bode well for us. And so I have struggled with getting behind the movement's sake because I know that we're not a Ferguson. I know that we're, the work that we do, we can just call the sheriff and the chief and have really tough conversations. And the outcome may not be what either of us wants, and we may not know how to get there, but we can bring people to the table to better understand how things work. So, for instance, with police, I have friends who are like, defund the police. And did you know that police get hired right away and they get a gun? I'm like, actually, no. It was like, as somebody who did recruitment for the sheriff's office, it actually takes 1.5 years for a deputy to get soloed. They're not on their own right out the gate. They have to go through training. But we have people out there who are supporting that movement who have no idea what the actual process looks like. And so I am the one who's like, let's talk about the process, because I think those pieces that you're hearing from this movement are false. And if you want to know the answers, I can sit down with you and bring those people to the table to ask those questions so you really know what's going on.
I think that if we really wanted to abolish the systems, it would really be a very, very hard fight. It wouldn't be something that happened instantaneously. A lot of people probably die, more people than we've already seen. Because, the Portland protests and the Salem protests, while they're scary right now, in the grand scheme of things, if we really were to go down that route, it would just get tremendously worse. And we'd see a lot more violence on like a day-to-day basis instead of just like at night in bigger cities.
And that's where the Black Lives Matter comes in, where it's like they should be treated, they should be tried just like everybody else who commits a crime. That is what the justice system is for. A cop is not the judge, jury, and the executioner. And that's the conversation that's disconnected. So when it comes to this phrase, I believe that there are people who don't understand that when you're in power, if you're afraid of something and you're in power, you probably shouldn't be in power. But Black faces, Black lives shouldn't be the reason that you're afraid. And what's the fear behind that? And really opening up people's minds of what their biases are and their blind spots.
And unfortunately, I think that that's the downfall with really trying to abolish the police. Like, let's say here in Salem I'm 45. I may never actually see that in my lifetime. You know what I mean? But I'm willing to work for it now for the future of Salem, for sure. So unfortunately, white supremacy is just so far embedded here. And the Brotherhood is just so strong that it's scary. Because in all honesty, I don't know if it could actually happen here because it's so well protected.
But there's such overwhelming evidence that people of color in particular are treated differently by our police. And there is such a level of violence and injury that occurs for minor crimes. And we don't see the same response for white folks. So yeah, until those disparities are addressed, I think in terms of reform, de-escalation is a thing, crisis management, and also diversifying the kinds of responses that law enforcement has. I think if it needs to be under the aegis of police, but more social workers who have experience working with the extremely ill emotionally, or medical professionals who know what to do with, someone in the midst of an addiction crisis. Is there any role for law enforcement there? Well, maybe this is outside my area of expertise, but I think we can do better than sending a couple of guys in a squad car with guns.
And we've been focusing a lot on the criminalization of Black and brown use, or Black, brown, and indigenous use, which obviously brings attention to Black Lives Matter, because a lot of Black people in our city are criminalized by the police, by school administrators, by SROs, by other systems of policing. But I think that seeing the spark in the movement this year has been very good for me to see, because before this year, I think it was a very taboo topic to talk about. To talk about the policing of people of color in general was very taboo. A lot of people before this year didn't really support the abolition of police. They didn't really support protecting Black lives in the way that a lot of people in this mainstream movement have, which I think is very good, because obviously it's an issue for decades that people have needed to be talking about, and we're finally talking about it.
I think that police reform is a huge topic and where my passions lie. And something that I've been talking to a friend who works at Salem Police is talking about the academy and what are the courses? So a deputy goes through a 6-month training if they want to be on patrol, which is enforcement. What are the classes they're taking? And when are the classes targeted about history and Oregon history between different race groups in Oregon? Other than just because they do mental health, they do crisis intervention, they do all those things. And they do some sort of bias training. But I don't think it's intense enough, extensive enough. And I really don't think there's a lot of collaboration between communities. I feel like my first instance of recognizing that this could be something that's great was that I was brought into a sergeant promotion for Salem Police, and I was there for a racial bias training. And basically my job was, I was a distraught mother who was accusing a cop of racially profiling my son. And I got to basically file a complaint. And they were interviewing the cops at the time on how they handled that conversation. And as the actor, or the whatever you call it, the person that's leading it, I could take it wherever I wanted. I could have been distraught, irate, kind. And I kind of let it play off of the interaction I had with each cop. I had 2 different interactions. One of them handled it amazingly. One of them was very kind, very respectful of my work. The other one was a total douche. And he got the brunt of my anger and my frustration. And I was very annoyed with him. And that was when I realized that how often are we doing that type of training? We're bringing actual stakeholders into these rooms to have conversations, to see firsthand where they can provide impact. And so I think that police reform in the same way, when it comes to the training piece, the training is where they learn all the basics. That's why you don't have to actually have a degree in criminal justice to be a cop. And people are like, we need a degree and we should have a degree in criminal justice. That has nothing. The criminal justice degrees at universities don't even scratch the surface of actual law enforcement. It's about learning what the judge does and what the courts do. It's not the actual work. The academy is where the work is learned. And so if we can be better at providing bias, discrimination training in those rooms, I think that we're going to come a lot further.
We really need some other programs for it to really come into fruition where the police can actually not be involved in every darn thing. And so I know that a Cahoots program is coming about, and I'm 100% all for that. And I think that, other programs need to be created, or even some of the mental health programs we have here, as far as the crisis center and stuff, they just need to be better funded. They need to be, the staff needs to be increased. We just have a real need for a lot more mental health services than we currently have.
I think when people say defund, I think a lot of people are squirrely about it. One of the things that I'm pushing for, and I've been doing interviews and stuff around, is getting a program like Cahoots in Eugene. I don't think law enforcement should be answering to mental health calls. I don't think law enforcement should be pulling guns on people at traffic stops. I think there's a fine line that we're walking between social services and policing. And at the moment, we're not doing a real great job of that. So I think, for me, would I like to see police abolition? 100%. Am I pragmatic and realistic in the fact that that will likely not happen in the near future? For sure. And I'm okay with taking it step by step. And I'm okay with defunding and getting a social services program. As far as my personal feelings on police, they're not my favorite. I don't necessarily have anything uber negative to say, but I certainly do not have anything positive to say either.
Could you give us a brief explanation for the record? What is Cahoots?
Yeah, Cahoots is a program down in Eugene that offers mental health services as well as they deal with the houseless population. They answer any call that's not criminal, essentially. So there's not like, there's a hierarchy of things. And if it's not a certain level, then Cahoots will respond.
I was a volunteer with Cahoots, and I also got picked up by Cahoots for being drunk in public. So it is literally a game changer, even though they have contracts with the police.
And I don't think someone who is in the midst of, an overdose or a bad trip, or someone who has profound mental illness and is maybe having a psychotic episode, I really don't think that's a criminal thing. And secondly, I don't think this is a situation where we send armed people with guns in to deal with this problem. I'm not someone who says we don't need police, but I think we need a much more diverse approach to the kinds of problems for which the police and other first responders are often called. And we need options other than jail for poor people.
I've seen it change a lot in the community. I mean, the police in Eugene, they still have a bad reputation as well. But yeah, I think that, Eugene's just different. Salem is so far behind in everything. The unsheltered are better taken care of in Eugene than they are here. And, when there are issues with that, just like the unsheltered population. Cahoots is called first, before the police are even called or any type of, disturbance. So I think that's really needed.
And do you know how well it's worked, Cahoots?
Fantastic. Yeah, it's great. It's actually saved the city of Eugene a ton of money, despite the initial investment. They've actually saved money. The hospital, the local hospitals have also saved money, and people are getting a lot better care and service. We see a lot less folks with mental health issues going into the system, and a lot of people getting the help they need, as far as addiction and things like that as well.
The system isn't going to give you the tools that you need to take it down.
Hi, welcome back. So, what can people do to fight for a cause they believe in? What does race-related activism look like? Here are some thoughts gathered from our interviews.
I still think that there is a lot more that needs to be done. I don't think this action on social media or even, a few community events every week is really enough. When we give people the time to stop thinking about it, to stop doing anything, when they don't feel like something needs to be done, like right now, they won't do it.
I think anybody really in this work for the long haul has to understand that this is going to be a step-by-step process. Even if we just take away let's take away the rabbit hole of racism in the whole United States and let's focus on Oregon. Even if we look at Oregon's history, Oregon was built to be a white utopia, right? So none of these laws were meant to inspire equity for women or for people of color. So just in our state alone, there's so much work that should be done as far as systemic racism. And it is a thing. It is real.
When we think about activism, protests often come to mind. We asked people for their thoughts on protests they've been to, as well as the act of protesting in general. When, if ever, should violence during protests be excused? Is protesting a necessary form of action? Here are some opinions on that, starting with a young man talking about his experience protesting.
I personally, I think I had a great time. It was I've never personally been like an activist. Like, of course, I'm an activist for trans rights, of course, but I've never been able to expand my horizons with activism. And it was nice to see how many other people felt the same way. Like, they realized that it was something they wanted to fight for, and I was so honored by those types of people, and it was really nice.
It was really eye-opening for me, especially to see people of all different ages there protesting against police brutality and racism.
I do stay involved as much as I can. I don't know. I'm not more of the beat the pavement type. I show up in solidarity and to, be supportive of my brothers and sisters.
I'm not into protesting really at all. I kind of just try to stay out of things.
I don't want to gather for vigils. I don't. It's not. I'm tired of it. I'm at a place right now where I feel like we don't gather enough in the joy. We just keep gathering in the sorrow and for vigils and for horrible reasons. And yeah, I want to be supportive and honor my own space. And it's often too much for me that the same folks are talking and they're telling the same sad stories, and it breaks my soul because I live those stories too, So yeah, I have to really be careful now.
We have a lot of protests in the big cities, like in Paris, but I just don't go because sometimes protests can be very dangerous.
In terms of virtues and ethics and our identity as Americans, I think freedom of speech and the right to assemble peacefully and protest and advocate is essential to our citizenship, and that our understanding of who we are as Americans. So I think there is a role for ensuring the demonstrations are safe and peaceful.
If those in power responded to the people who can use their words and who do have a gift for speaking and for communication, I would think that those people who can't express themselves wouldn't need to act out as they act out. So do I encourage it? No. But do I support those people and their feelings? Yes. I will never look at somebody who's frustrated that they, tag something, and I'll never look at them and say, your feelings are no longer valid because of the actions that you took. There's also a piece of that, though, that has to do with who's doing it. I think a lot of the time you find that there are white people at these protests who do this property destruction. Of all the demonstrations I've been to, all the Black leadership has never advocated for any type of property destruction, and anybody who does kind of branch off and take matters into their own hands, and their actions result in problems, most of the time typically are white. And that's a hard place for people to be in, because, are you so frustrated that you have to break something, or are you just trying to do it because you're looking for an excuse to break something?
Mostly when I see elite in military sort of uniforms with their shields and their very large guns and the light cannons or whatever they have, my fear is if you outfit the police like soldiers, they will treat citizens like the enemy.
To go out and break the law because I'm upset about something that happened is not the way to do it. Don't go hurt somebody else, break windows, destroy people's property, and hurt other people because I'm angry about an injustice. Pray for those people. Pray for the injustice to stop.
So I believe they do need to be policed, but it shouldn't have come to violent protests in the first place. I believe peaceful protests are the best way in some ways. But I understand peaceful protests they don't get enough attention. And that's why they turn to the violent protests, because that's the only way they're being heard. It shouldn't be like that in the first place. But if that's the only way they're going to be heard, then that's what it's got to be resorted to. So I don't agree with looting small businesses. I don't agree with setting things on fire. But if that's the way it's got to be heard and to bring, why is that the only way it should be brought to the media?
You know, it's really hard to explain this because there is just this like collective anger and this collective rage. And there's a breaking point. And I think most Black people in America have reached that point.
There are some methods that I don't believe the movement handles the best way. And as a believer, as somebody who is all about encouraging peace, I don't always agree with how things go about. Doesn't necessarily mean I don't think it's valid, because my father grew up in Compton during the Watts riots. So, I know that there is power in stomping the streets. Myself, that's just not how I am.
There was an event in Washington, D.C. that I think made all the papers that involved the Episcopal Church. There were peaceful protesters at and near the church, and there were clergy from that church on site handing out water and so forth to the protesters and being there for support and watchfulness. And there was no evidence and everyone there was exercising their First Amendment rights. And then all of a sudden, with tear gas and rubber bullets, the area was cleared. That included chasing people off the church's own property. Clergy were tear gassed, standing in front of their own church. I think that's deeply troubling.
Large numbers of allies have recently begun engaging in activism. We asked people what they considered to be the role of allies in the movement, and why so many non-Black people have joined forces this summer in support of Black Lives Matter.
I honestly think that it was being in quarantine. A lot of people had more time to really read about things, more time to just spend looking at the news, or more time to just spend on social media, seeing about the atrocities that had happened. Because obviously before that, everyone was doing their own thing. They had their goals they wanted to achieve. A lot of people were just busy, always doing things. But when everything in your life just kind of pauses, you have time to spend on just much smaller things. And so when maybe I was already doing those things, a lot of people just weren't doing it for XYZ reason. But when they had nothing else to do with their time, but just see what's going on, obviously it's going to anger a lot more people, and it's going to just get a lot more attention.
What do you think is something that can be done on the civilians' part?
I think showing up. I think that's a huge part. I think when community leaders ask you to write emails or they ask you to show up, I think that's one of the biggest myths about allyship is that, there has to be some specific way that you're helping. But we literally have I have somebody who does graphics. We have somebody who bakes and brings snacks. I mean, anything you're good at, you can lend to this movement. And I think it's so important that people understand that, because literally, we have somebody who sews masks. somebody who runs a website for us so we can get donations. I mean, there's literally all kinds of things you can do. And I think that's what needs to be done is you just need to figure out, who your community leaders are, who are the folks doing this work. So like Luce, the NAACP, Mano a Mano, PCUN, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. People have been doing this work in our community for a long, long time. We just need to get behind them and support them.
Like maybe you can't go to a protest or you can't donate money, but you can recommend documentaries to watch. You can read books. You can uplift Black people, Black social media accounts, Black businesses, etc. There's a lot of work that can be done, even if you do have limitations.
The other part of allyship to me is being willing to take that stance when it's not popular for you. A lot of people come to the rallies and they show up and they start tearing stuff up and acting a fool, but they get to go home and put their signs down. I don't get to take my skin off. So that is something to consider.
Black Lives Matter isn't necessarily directly impacting me because I'm not Black. I do recognize that there are a lot of social justice issues that do impact me. And if I'm able to help other people be alleviated of the trauma and the pain of these problems, I think it'd be very good for me to be able to do that, because I know that a lot of those people have helped me in the past fight for those issues that actually do impact me.
And on a related note, what is anti-racism? And how does it play into the social changes we are seeing? Here are some responses we got.
Anti-racist. That means that you are checking your bias, right? So, if you get into an elevator with a Black man and grab your purse, why are you doing that? Are you asking yourself those questions? Because we all have unconscious bias. So it's actively learning to be anti-racist.
My role, and what I believe should be others' role, is to take active steps to ensure there is a fair playing field where everyone has reasonably the same opportunities to achieve their goals. More importantly, as a member of our larger community, I and others need to be aware and constantly evaluating that playing field and removing unnecessary obstacles that impede the realization of people's goals. I say it is more important because obstacles often only impact certain groups, whether they are due to race, religion, sexual identity, cultural identity, or socioeconomic classes. This is difficult work that takes constant vigilance because even what we thought to be policies to remove obstacles in the past may have created new obstacles now. It takes sensitivity and awareness to tackle these challenges and pursue a fair playing field for every community member.
I feel like in society, there's some higher level thought that it's like, if like I said, if I read all the books, if I knew one or two Black people and I asked the right questions, then I've accomplished racism. And I don't think that that's the truth. And I think that asking that question, it's like, this is not something that we're going to accomplish. You know what I mean? And we've got to stop thinking about it that way because people will assume that the work is done, and the work is never going to be done because there's always going to be some sort of structure that gets shifted. So, the conversation is going to change.
It's going to look different for everybody. I think the thing that what draws people away from it and what terrifies people is that they think that they have to be out marching in the streets. Anti-racism is not just marching in the streets. Anti-racism is what you do in your classroom. Anti-racism is what books you read to your children and what shows you watch. Anti-racism is who you hire. Anti-racism is who you treat with just general respect and dignity. Everybody can do their part in creating an equitable society. It doesn't have to be the same for everybody. And I don't know if that's been expressed enough to people. Your activism is not going to look the same as everybody else's. But the fact that you're just doing something is better than nothing.
Helping people understand that to be racist doesn't mean you have this active emotion level dislike or hatred of people of color. has to do with the way our culture is set up, that advantages some people to the disadvantage of others.
I'm realizing that, especially over the past year, I'm realizing that there are so many layers to discrimination. There's, blatant racism, homophobia, transphobia, stuff like that. And it leads all the way down into microaggressions. But in that spectrum, there are so many different things that are considered discriminatory. And now even if I'm not like aware and conscious all the time, I'm trying to be more conscious about saying or thinking something or being more conscious about, doing something else that may be perceived as negative, even though I'm not trying to portray it that way. And I think that it can be hard for a lot of people to be completely aware of their actions and their thoughts all the time. So I think that we need to start normalizing and start consciously being aware of different things that we're saying and how we're going to present ourselves in the situation or what we're going to say.
Many people are concerned about performative activism, which is activism done for personal gain instead of in genuine support of a movement. When asked about performative activism, this is how people responded.
I think knowledge is important. I think knowledge is wasted if there's no action. And so I feel like, while I think that my white brothers and sisters and friends who are trying to be allies think that by reading every book you're going to know more about the topic, unless you're actually using your privilege and acting, it's really not worth it. And when I say using your privilege, I don't mean going and burning down monuments. I don't mean protesting. That's not the work. My dad gave a speech and it was the best thing at one of the rallies. He said, it was at the Juneteenth celebration/rally. And he said, "This is all great. I love everything, everyone that's here. I love that you're standing out here. You're standing up for a cause, but this is not the work." He's like, the work is not standing here with a sign or kneeling. The work is getting into the Capitol and talking to the officials. The work is voting for people of color that you think are qualified to do the job. And my dad was someone who ran for an office and he didn't win. And he's like, no, like if all of you guys here would have voted for me, I would have been in office, right? And so I think that knowledge is great, but if you're not willing to act and you're not willing to challenge yourself to essentially put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is oppressed.
I have seen a lot of people just using the movement as an aesthetic, where they were posting about it, for the first 2 or 3 weeks of the movement, just so they didn't look like a terrible person. And then after that, they don't really post anything, or they'll share like a cute graphic. But really, they aren't doing anything for the movement. And I think that's almost more harmful than it's not, because it kind of creates this idea that there is like a lot of mass support for it, when in reality, a lot of people aren't doing as much as they can.
I've heard in the media and from some of my own friends who are people of color that they're pretty tired of the fair weather white allies, who will show up for the high protest BLM march downtown, whatever. They'll put their BLM lawn sign out. It doesn't really go much beyond that. And also, I think people of color are really tired of being asked to help. Why I said earlier, right? That white people have to do more listening, and people of color are really tired of being asked to explain it to us. And I've heard several times that white people, you got to start doing your own work. The data is there. You can find that. You can read the books. Stop setting up these events where a person of color comes to talk to you so that you feel like you did something, right? Actually do something and take responsibility for yourselves. And allyship. Yeah, generally totally in favor of allyship. Sounds great. But my understanding from what I've heard in the conversation is that sometimes allyship is more of a convenience. So that has to be improved, right?
What is the role of white people in the movement? Is the white savior complex a problem?
I do think that the white culture, there's a lot of you got to stop trying to be the hero. Stop trying to come in here and save and fix it. Listen to some uncomfortable conversations, put yourself into some uncomfortable roles.
I don't think that it's my job as a person of color to fix. Racism is a white people problem, point blank and period.
I think there are a lot of people who don't really know about like the white savior complex. They don't really realize, and they think, oh, because I'm white, I have to speak for them. I have to. I have to say what they're saying so they can be heard. But they have a voice. They have a voice, just not everyone is willing to listen. So you project their voice. You don't speak for them, you project it.
No, I do not think there's enough space for Black voices. Yes, I do believe that white people have inserted themselves and have not asked enough questions and really stepped back. It's the giving of power. Like being an ally is the giving of your power. And one of my friends said something to me just a week ago about being an ally, and she's white. And so I sit on a board for diversity and inclusion for my job. And so I have a lot of conversations about this in general. But she had said, you're not an ally until a person of color tells you you are. And I think there's been a sense of white people saying, I'm an ally, and they're just taking that mantle. But who are the people of color that they are collaborating with? Where are they getting that information? Just because you read White Fragility, all of a sudden you know everything, right? So I think that there has definitely been I'm taking the mantle because I need to speak for my brothers and sisters. And the point is like, no, you need to step aside and bring your brother or sister alongside of you so they can have a voice at the table that you're at, right? And support that voice.
Yeah. And I might add, again, since we do have disparity of political power and influence, one of the things white people have to do is use their power right now to give away some of their power.
Having conversations about these kinds of hot button issues can be difficult. Here are some people talking about their experiences having these conversations and how it may affect their relationships.
I mean, sometimes people ask me stupid shit. Like, what about your hair? It's just the weirdest shit that you would never ask another white person. And that's okay. Like, okay, if that's what we need, like, if that's what you feel like, that's the question you need to ask for you to make it over the hump to anti racism, cool. Like, let's get there. Be like, dope. And then after you ask your questions and I answer it, I'll tell you that's dumb. And you probably shouldn't ask another black person. But uncomfortable conversations are required for growth. And anybody that really cares about you, I think about it like this. I care about my children, right? So when they make a mistake, I'm going to lovingly correct them and give them the opportunity to grow. And I think the same is true of anti racism. I think a lot of people's hearts are in the right place. They just haven't been around anyone to have that conversation with, or when they've said something wrong, someone jumps down their throat and attacks them. And then there's a defense up about this topic. So either they shut down and they don't want to talk about it anymore, or they go in the opposite direction. And now all black people are bad and all black people are this. And I really don't care for that. I think we should be able to have adult conversations and move forward.
There's a guy at the coffee shop. I used to avoid him because he was obviously a Trump supporter or a gun rights supporter. But I would see him so often that we started saying hi and we got to know each other's names and began to interact a little bit. And I realized that me having nothing to do with this guy, as opposed to me having a friendship or relationship with him, so that next time someone says, "Oh, those goddamn liberals," he'll realize that, well, I know one, and he's not such a bad guy. So I think it's important to really try to make connections across unusual divides that you might not expect to see happen. I think we all have to be creative in that respect and not just pin a label on another person and say they're this or they voted for this person, therefore they just no good, and I don't want anything to do with them. That's not going to get us where we need to go.
As far as my friends go, that's a really kind of weird thing. Because truthfully, I felt like I had a lot more friends before all of this happened. And I've heard some people post them, or they posted stuff, or they've said some things, and I'm just like, whoa, like fundamentally at our core, we're different human beings. And I didn't really recognize that, so I've lost a lot of friends.
It is challenging to have difficult discussions, but it is more challenging when people are indirect and don't make their views clear. Few positive results come from not having the courage to have difficult conversations.
But truthfully, we can agree to disagree on pretty much anything. Racism ain't one of them.
It's important to see how people's views have changed over time. Here we have clips of people talking about how they thought about race as a child and how that may have changed as they got older.
When I was a child, I really had no clue about what racism was. I had as much friends that were Black or Asian or white.
When I was younger, it never really was a big thing, like talked about around me. I think that's because I was brought up in Tamsworth, which is a very white place. I think it's like 95% white or something like that. There actually was a TV show about it at one point, Big British School Swap. Because there wasn't many people of different ethnic minorities, it wasn't a big thing that was talked about. As I've got older, I've met more people from diverse backgrounds, and I'm going to say universities or sixth forms, which have different people in them. And so it is talked about more because there's obviously been on social media more, there's a greater presence about it. So then I'm hearing about it more and I'm discussing it more with friends and family.
Yeah, I think I kind of touched on a little bit about my identity when I went to Louisiana. But I grew up here in Oregon, and I mean in Salem specifically. And in many rooms, even today, I was the only person of color. And so even through school, I went to private school for 4 years. I was the only person of color in that whole school. And there's probably 300 kids total. And so I think when I was younger, I don't think I really understood, because nobody was really walking alongside of me to try to help me understand why it was awkward. Why was it awkward for me to be in rooms and wonder, why isn't someone still talking to me? Why don't I have as many friends? Why do they make jokes about my hair and stuff like that? So I definitely felt myself asking the same questions of I don't understand what is wrong with me being different. And so then I think I didn't have anybody really giving me the support to do that.
I grew up in a small Baptist church, and so we sang Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white. You know that old children's song? And we'd sing that, and I'd go, oh yeah, everybody's different colors. God loves everybody. So that's the only way I ever really thought about race as a kid.
When I think about kids, and you think about the dynamic between different races of kids, and when you teach your kids something, kids don't learn how to be hateful, mean people. That, it's a taught behavior. And I think that I am realizing for me just how much parents and the bias of the people that raise these kids really seep through, and how they're taught, and how they interact, the questions they asked, or a lot of it has to do with jokes or something if they've heard their parents say and they just repeat it. And so I think I've learned to not really be frustrated with the kid who had said it, but really looking at how were you raising your kids? You know what I mean? And I think it really plays in for me when it comes to being an adult and the influence I can have on children. I don't have my own kids, but I work with kids, and watching the hate form from people just because they don't know, it's lack of knowledge. It's a fear of irrelevancy. I feel like it has everything with fear. I'm not relevant. My views don't matter. This is what the history books told me. This is what my class, this is what I was raised. And this is what I know. I'm safe here. Nobody wants to feel unsafe. Nobody wants to feel uncomfortable. And so for me, I've recognized that I've had to be uncomfortable, and I've lived my life uncomfortably because I've always just been me. And and I didn't have 30 of myself walking around where I can just walk into a room and feel safe. And when I say feel safe, I mean emotionally safe, right? And so I think for me, in regards to my progression in it, I've really had to learn how to say what I mean, learn how to say what I feel, and not be afraid of how it affects somebody else. Because I've walked around in my own shell of well, I don't want to piss him off, right? I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I don't want to be singled out because of it, right? It's the question of a person of color. I get sick of people saying, well, you always make it about race. And I'm like, well, but that's me. Like, I can't change. It's going to be different. And it's all it is a defense mechanism. You know what I mean? On either side. But I've gotten so used to being, oh yeah, like I don't want them to think that I'm just being like that girl, or I'm saying this and living in it, you know, living fearfully. I've had to teach myself that who I am, how I am, the uniqueness of what I am matters. And it's going to be different, and that's okay, right? But recognizing is going to be different, and then not being afraid to stand up for myself. When people are unwilling to challenge themselves, it's I thought the white lens is unwilling to be uncomfortable, because you've never had to be uncomfortable. And I walk that line every single day where I'm feeling like I'm uncomfortable and not making excuses for my friends and the people that I know to not live in that uncomfortable for a minute, right? Your minute of uncomfortable is a lifetime for me. So you can sit there and deal with it.
I think throughout these conversations, I really became more radical than I already was. You know, I went from being just a typical liberal who, you know, worked in the Capitol for policies and worked for the governor and all these things, to being someone that like directly opposed these government structures, to someone who like had like the facts to support the reasons why these government structures are terrible, to supporting the complete abolition of the structures.
Well, I come from a world that you guys would probably have a hard time even believing or imagining, because I'm from Georgia, and I was raised until about what age I'm not sure when they outlawed segregation, but when I was growing up in Georgia, you know, there were signs around that said, you know, whites only for a drinking fountain. There would be, you know, blacks in the back of the bus, whites in the front. All of the schools were segregated. And so there was, you know, no interaction really with black people. That was a real separate society. And, you know, I had the good fortune to live outside of the South when I was growing up for 2 years on an army base. My dad worked for the Red Cross, and the army base was integrated. So, you know, I didn't have an older brother. So I met this friend of my best friend's older brother. His best friend was sort of like, became an older brother to me for a period of time. And he was a black guy. And at that age, I didn't even think about it. Just that this guy's name was Gus. And I thought, here's Gus. He's an older guy. And if his race, it didn't register to me as being any different than, you know, his hair was red or something like that. It was just something that you don't even think about. And so when I moved back to the South, I had the opportunity to have had an experience of living with blacks around, and all of a sudden I was back in a society that was strictly segregated.
I'm really now at the age of 70, having lived a life as an African-American woman with 4 African-American children and a husband who was in the white world, as a black pharmacist who died. Indirectly, I feel the structural racism. I never had a word for it and didn't really understand it.
We talked to a few people from England and Italy, asking about their view of the United States, as well as how they viewed racism in their own country.
There's always been this undertone, especially from the people I've grown up around, which is America has a race problem. And it's portrayed, especially now after the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, America still has a race problem. And it was kind of portrayed that when Barack Obama first became president, it was, oh, we're going to solve it now because we have an African-American president. And then as his presidency went along, and then as Donald Trump became president, it just revolved in America has got a major issue with race.
I think everyone generalizes, so I won't. I really want them to know how the United States can be, because what I hear from them a lot of times is that they're bad and they don't want to go there. And like, I understand what you're saying because we know what's happening, but I know that the States can be very beautiful. So I don't want them to have a bad idea about it.
The view from the British perspective at first was, oh my God, that's so crazy. I can't believe they're having to have this debate because how come in 2020 race is still an issue? And then as we started to think about it, we realized that race is still an issue also in the UK, and racism is still an issue. America in general, you're just seeing it's crazy. And you have very large portion sizes, and you all have guns because that's a major thing. We don't have them here. Like no one has them. And so all growing up, it's always been Americans, they have guns. Like, but at the moment with politics and your president, and most people in the UK think he's crazy. I don't really know anyone who's quite liked him. But yeah, America, it's weird because then we always get told about the special relationship the UK has with America. But it's always been a view. I don't know, on the view that I've been told, that always a bit. Whereas America, because they're bigger than us and they do crazier things than we do, which is kind of impressive because we're British.
The one thing that I saw that really annoyed me and frustrated me was Tamir Rice. He was a young child with a toy gun who got shot dead. There's a white girl that went to her prom with a gun and a rifle on her back, and nothing was said. How can that be that? But that's showing the racial divide with the guns argument. Whereas in England, we haven't got that. So it's not as obvious, but I know that we've been educated on the London riots of 2011, and that was because a black man got shot.
It was, as always, you get it reported in the UK as there's been another shooting by police in America. So initially it was, oh, the American police have gone and shot another black person.
After all of the controversy and the protests, we asked if they thought this would have any kind of lasting effect on our country.
I think it already has. I think we've already seen, and we are a part of the major change going on. And I think that's what's causing it, right? The unrest and the disruption from both sides. It comes from both sides. It comes from all sides. You know, whenever folks feel threatened, they react. And but yeah, I think we are already seeing change, and I think it's going to keep happening because I think that the momentum and the real desire is truly there. So yeah, I think it's happening, and I think it will continue to happen.
I do believe that America will move forward, and recent events involving racial equality will have a positive impact for the long term. In the short term, there may be difficulties and a feeling that we have taken 2 steps forward and 1 step back. That is to be expected. The development of the United States is much like our own lives. It is a journey seeking to achieve our goals, and change and improvement is rarely easy.
I think that the protests are a way of telling the world what is really happening in America. And I think it really worked because in all around the world, I think that Black Lives Matter is touching people. And so I think maybe it will open the eyes of the government. I don't know, but I really hope so.
I hope it changes for the better, but like there's so many different aspects. It's not only just the protests aren't like they'll change a lot, but they won't change everything we need. And I hate that. We have to do this. We have to get people in government, and we have to have like people who will fight for Black Lives Matter in the government. And right now, I feel like we don't have that. We have people that will, but I don't think we have enough. We don't have the majority, and that's a difficult thing to like think about, because you want the government to like be a representation of the people, but right now they're not representing everyone.
And after all this talk about the way things were and how things are changing, we asked our final question. What would be your idea of a perfect America?
This is it's a weird thing to think about, but a perfect America would be, to me, would be not having America. Like, it's so deep, it's so rooted. Like, systemic racism is so rooted in what we are and where we've come from. I feel like if Christopher Columbus, if he had just never came and we just let everyone live their lives over in Britain or in North America, let them do their thing, I feel like everything would be so much better, at least in North America. Like, it wouldn't be considered America, but they're still more like, I don't know how to say it, but like a perfect America wouldn't exist. It'd be Britain and North America. It'd be the Native Americans' land, and it'd be Britain. Like, I don't know. It's so deep in our history that it's hard to get rid of. I personally don't think there will ever be a perfect America. I think there will always be something more to fight for. But I think that the closest thing we can get is everybody treating each other with not just equality, but equity, which is giving everybody what they need to succeed.
I honestly think that the perfect America would look a lot like the villages we idolize so much in remote parts of the world, where everyone takes care of each other. I think it would look like a community, you know? It would look like a one nationwide community where we're all taking care of each other's needs regardless, where we can all do that, where it can take care of that. And it's not going to happen overnight, because this country was built almost, 300 years ago to be in this current function.
Oh, I don't think there'll ever be a perfect America. I don't know, man. Honestly, I want to work and I want to be able to live my life. And, I mean, it would be great if everyone could just come together and talk about things, the whole left and the right. I think it's all stupid. I think everybody should kind of meet in the middle and hear everybody out and, hear their side and hear their side. And okay, well, what can we do to basically compromise so that, I know everybody's not going to be happy, but that's never going to be the case. But I think that that's the perfect America, is really just everybody being able to have a discussion instead of canceling people for having an idea or an opinion, or I don't know.
My idea of a perfect America is both equality and equity. So equality being, that's pretty self-explanatory, equality for all, regardless. Everybody's equal. There will still be minority groups like people with mental illness or people who are disabled. And that's when equity kicks in, being like, okay, so this is open to everyone, but here are some people who might need a little bit of an extra push because they maybe can't function on their own, or they need some extra help in these specific areas, stuff like that. So I think first we have to get it to equality, and then we can get to equity, and then we'll be at a perfect America.
America is a very unique country, a very unique situation. We have a system that is unique, special, that is unlike really anything else that you've seen before. And I think even to this day, it's still unique.
A perfect America is one that lives up to its principles laid out in its founding. When America and its people have failed, sometimes horribly so, it was not because its principles were wrong, but because people failed to apply and live up to those principles. America should be a place where people are free to be who they are and pursue a life to their potential and achieve their goals without obstacles in their way because of what they may look like, where they grew up, or what they believe.
A lot has changed in the past year, even since we conducted these interviews last summer and fall. We hope that this has offered you some food for thought, and we encourage you to start conversations about race with the people around you. Thank you for watching our show. All proceeds are going to be given to the Equitable Giving Tree, an Oregon-based nonprofit with the goal of creating a future with accessible opportunities and equity building throughout Portland's BIPOC communities. And special thanks to our interviewees. We hope we did their words justice. Have a lovely night.